I like to take reference photos, so I took this one the other day and I put it into GIMP, edited it way down to have a composition that I liked better, and I used some oil pastels and did a quick study in my sketchbook. So that's what this video is. I've sped it up at 4 times the speed, so I hope you enjoy. What I did was I taped down the edges in my sketchbook that has a heavier paper. It's more like a Bristol paper. Or if you're not familiar with Bristol, it's sort of like a cardstock. And then I'm using a Pentel oil pastel to draw in the basic shapes of items and get the composition down of where I want things. I use Pentel a lot at the very beginning for this process. They're a harder oil pastel. They don't go on thick. And I don't press hard here either. I use a very light hand. And then this is me working on the foreground. I consider this the first step, is just laying out the composition like you just saw. And then the second step is getting the base colors down. And here I'm getting the shore on the other side of the lake. And I'm using a blue so it will help show some atmospheric depth. And then I'm blocking in the lake here. And I'm not paying real strict attention to lines as far as the initial drawing. You want to get the color closest to the actual item if you're going for realism. But like the trees are not this brown shade, so they'll be changed throughout the process. But here I'm just getting the basic colors down. And I'm not putting a lot of details on the tree limbs. And you'll notice that I didn't put the sky down first. I went for working on the trees first. And I like the look of the edges when you're working back and forth between areas like that. So then I start laying in the sky there. And this is a much too bright blue, but it was the closest and the lightest that I had in my color choices. So that's what I used. And you'll see how I deal with the changing of the color of that. And again, I'm not being real picky about the shapes, about going, right to the line and getting everything perfect. It's still pretty loose. The grass is sort of a dirty yellow, I guess. And this is me laying in the shadow area of the trees. And I use a blue for a number of reasons. There's a contrast between the yellows and the browns and the blue, but it also is a cooler blue. Here I'm trying to get closer to the color of the lake, so I'm going over this with a shade of blue that still isn't quite right, but I'm getting the colors down. Here's me lightening up the sky with a white oil pastel over the blue. I'm not completely wiping out the blue, I'm just toning it down so it's not so stark, so vibrant. It was sort of a hazy, cloudy, gloomy day, weather-wise. And I like these edges that are showing up between the tree limbs and the sky there. Sort of reminds me of maybe a stained glass. But I like the play back and forth that shows up when I do that. It is probably a lot more work to do the shapes like this for the sky, but I like the end result. So, and I'm working on the water again. Again, I'm lightening it up. It was too dark, and I'm going over it with it looks white on camera, but it's actually a little bit off-white. Here I'm using the Paul Rubens oil pastel. I've switched over to the softer, just making adjustments to the base colors and any tweaks I need to make on composition. The composition on this was pretty straightforward, so I didn't have to make major changes. Mostly I'm focusing in on the tree trunks at this point and just making sure that they're the right width. And I also took the brown over that blue shadow area. And here I'm working on the shoreline and the grass, getting it a little closer to that dirty yellow looking that it was naturally. But I'm not trying to go for a tight, super realistic look here. And here I'm adding the blue back into the shadow area. I like it where the oil pastel is thick enough that you can kind of push it around a little bit, and I keep working on it, adding layers. Oftentimes I like to add a blue tone to the shadows of trees, just to kind of cool them down on one side. Also adds a nice contrast when there's a golden or a yellowish color, if the blue in the trees fits the situation. And here I'm working on the clouds in the sky a little bit to get things down. It was midday, so there were not a lot of shadows in the clouds. It was pretty flat looking, and that was fine to me to have that also in this image to help give it a little more depth. You can see the 3 or 4 planes there with the foreground, the trees, the lake, the other edge of the lake, and then the sky. You'll see too, I don't have my strokes going the same way every time I put it down. I will go different directions or just kind of smoosh it around. Sometimes you can take a lighter color over a darker one if there's a lot of oil pastel on the surface, and you can just kind of lightly go over it, just barely touching the surface, and smooth out those strokes or have them appear the way that you want them to. And then I'm refining some edges here. So this is closer to step 4, where you start adding some details, refining the colors a bit. You'll see I haven't put the really thin limbs or twigs onto the trees yet. I'm just working back and forth, playing with the sky, trying to get a little more depth to it because it is so light. I want to make sure that it looks like it is falling behind the trees. We know that mentally, intellectually, but I wanted it to appear that way also. And I just keep playing back and forth here with the colors, tweaking it. In order to get those thin lines too on the limbs, I will need to use the edge of a broken pastel so it's nice and sharp, or I'll need to sharpen one to get those lines. Or I could do it the opposite way and lay down some dark at the very beginning with light over it and then scratch out the limbs with a tool. Here I'm getting closer to the final step, just reinforcing some colors and shadows. And that blue shadow area is just too solid. There's no texture. And the same thing with the trees. They're too flat looking. I do have a blue and a brown on them, but they need something else, a highlight area, something to give them more form. It's important that we think about the value of things, the light and the dark. It's been said that value does all the work, but color gets the applause. So if I wanted to make the sky a different color, I don't have to make it blue. I could have made it a purplish or a pinkish, but as long as it was that same value, I would have been I would have been okay. I could make it work. Here I'm adding some more highlights, get a little more texture in the ground. I'm using a very light value of yellow ochre to get those in. And I continue to work on different areas at the same time and not focus in tightly on one spot and get that spot exactly how I want it and then move to the next. And this will help it visually look like it's all been worked as one piece and not piece by piece. It helps give it some cohesion. Also, the yellow ochre that I used on the ground, there were more than just the one shade. It may be difficult to tell on camera, but there's several different values in there of a yellowish brown. Here I'm adding some highlights to the trees to help give them a little bit of shape. But I want to be careful because I don't want to add too many, because of these shadows on the ground. It'll make it confusing. So I'm adding more limbs. And here I'm using a scratching tool to just kind of scrape away some of the excess in areas to help fine-tune some of those smaller limbs. And I'll go back and forth between using the tool and using a pastel to kind of smooth those edges. And I spend quite a bit of time here going back and forth with some of the details, but I try not to spend too much time. Notice I said try. And toward the end here, I'm using more of the Sennelier pastels that have a texture sort of like a lipstick. They're very, very, very soft. And you'll notice too, I'm wearing gloves. This just helps with cleanup and just keeps the oil pastel from getting all over my hands. It also prevents me being exposed to the pigments and the materials that may be in the oil pastels. It's just smart to not expose yourself to anything unnecessary like that if possible. These last few minutes I keep going back and forth on areas, playing with the value, tweaking it some. I'm also making sure that I don't have a cloud showing up on one side of the tree and then it just gets chopped off. The clouds were very soft that day. And here I'm focusing on the values, the extremes, the darks and the lights, and making sure that I've got my darkest areas and my lightest areas to go along with those middle tones so that it gives it some form. I don't want my trees to look like they're square. I want them to have a roundness to them. I like this blue tone. I added the lighter blue tone down in that shadow, but it's a bit too much. So, and here I'm scratching into those blue marks and just making them work in with the colors that are around it, so it's not so sharp. Here I'm working on my shoreline just to make sure that it's right before I call it done. For me, the most fun part is pulling off that tape, and you see that nice clean edge along the finished piece. There's just a feeling of satisfaction at that moment. So at this point, I would take it outside and spray it with fixative, and or put a piece of paper, usually wax paper, over the top of it. And of course sign it. So that's our demo for today. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you for being here. Take care, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe.